I watched her documentary before she ever became big. I think I seen it on PBS, on Channel 13. You can tell she was a rough. She had anger problems. She was not ladylike. She was nigga boy, tomboy. Nah, and she, nigga, she went through the process and corrected what needed to be corrected to represent what a champ is. She ain't no Layla Ali. None of our new youth are what our old stars used to be. They got their own mind, they got their own identity. So nah, they picking on Clarissa. And can't nobody whoop her. So
listen up, because what you're about to hear isn't gossip. It's not speculation. And it sure isn't the kind of story you scroll past without a second thought. This is the moment the truth peels back its mask. When Charleston White spoke, he didn't shout. He didn't perform. He dismantled. And that quiet nobody questioned? That quiet was screaming secrets louder than anyone dared to imagine. For years, the world bought the image. Flawless victories, picture-perfect moments, a love story painted in gold and applause. But then Charleston White steps forward, calm, cutting through the illusion, asking what no one else had the courage to ask. What if this was never love? What if it was manipulation? What if every smile, every embrace, every headline was carefully choreographed? He didn't launch attacks. He didn't shout into the void. He did something far more dangerous. He traced the invisible lines, connected the hidden dots. And what did he reveal? That Clarissa Shields wasn't born into fame or perfection. She was raw, relentless, untamed. And somewhere along the way, she was molded, not just into a champion, but into a machine. A persona that demanded obedience, control, and the quiet submission of everyone in her orbit. And here, the story slips into darkness. Because while the world watched the fights, another battle raged behind closed doors, one fueled by influence, money, image, and authority. And standing there, quietly orchestrating it all, wasn't just a partner. It was a gatekeeper. Someone whose silence wasn't by accident. It was a weapon. Charleston White didn't throw blame. He didn't scream betrayal. He did something far more terrifying. He let the pattern expose itself. He let the hush, the pauses, the omissions, the invisible lines tell the story. And suddenly, the love everyone celebrated began to look less like passion and more like a contract with fine print no one read. Because real love doesn't need this much control.
Clarissa Shield wants to have babies with Papoose while he's still married to Remy.
They gonna look like African kids, Ugandan babies. Yeah. They ain't gonna know if them babies Nigerian, Jamaican, or Haitian. But they gonna have some pretty chocolate skin. Don't know if their hair gonna be too straight or wavy. They may have African hair. But they sure gonna be nigga kids. Yeah. They gonna be some smart kids that know how to fight.
What made this moment so chilling wasn't the volume of Charleston White's words. It wasn't the anger or the theatrics. It was the precision, the calm. The way he spoke like a surgeon, cutting through illusions, reminding everyone of truths they had long refused to see. This wasn't a tirade. It was a rewrite of reality. And as he spoke, the entire story surrounding Charleston White, Clarissa Shields, and Papoose quietly began to unravel. He didn't question Clarissa's skill. He questioned the architecture built around it. He didn't deny her dominance. He exposed how carefully that dominance had been curated, guarded, and packaged. Because in modern fame, the deadliest weapon isn't failure. It's untouchability. When someone becomes too central to a story, when questioning them feels taboo, that's when control takes its deepest root. Charleston highlighted something most fans never saw. Clarissa's rise wasn't just talent. It was sculpted, refined, managed. Not because she lacked ability, but because the persona surrounding her could never risk chaos. The public saw ferocity, but behind the curtain was strategy. Fights selected meticulously, risks neutralized silently, a persona that felt raw but moved with premeditation. Then he shifted the lens not to the ring, but to the shadows around it. To the figures shaping perception, access, and silence. Enter Papoose, not a lover in the narrative, but a stabilizer. Subtle, unobtrusive, yet omnipresent. The kind of force that never demands notice, yet quietly guarantees the story stays intact. Charleston didn't say Papoose controlled Clarissa. He revealed something more insidious. A system where protection becomes a filter, where the same hand that shields also decides what reaches the world. Silence in that dynamic isn't absence, it's policy. That's when the love story dissolves. Suddenly, it doesn't read as passion, it reads as alignment. He suggested this wasn't emotional. It was transactional. Clarissa required credibility, stability, and insulation from chaos. Papoose required relevance, influence, and a place in the spotlight. Together, they weren't just a couple, they were a fortified narrative. In an industry obsessed with perception, narrative control is—
That nigga Papoose, and this is why I say that. You ain't never heard no hoe come out and say nothing bad about him first. Even when his hoe was doing wrong, he wasn't running to the internet bashing her. And he don't speak much. He's a man of silence, so that means his words are important to him. I done seen him get with 2 women, and seemed like he brought the best out of both women. Yeah, I don't know too many niggas that go hold their girl down.
That silence wasn't innocence. Charleston framed it as discipline. And discipline, he suggested, is the cloak people mistake for morality. When someone never reacts publicly, the world assumes there's nothing to respond to. But the truth is far more calculated. It often signals a mastery of restraint sharper than anyone else in the room. From there, the tone turned darker. Charleston White spoke about what happens when fame peaks, but identity stagnates. When relevance fades and proximity to power becomes the quickest route back into the spotlight. He didn't claim Papoose exploited Clarissa. He revealed something more subtle. Opportunity gravitates toward the prepared, and when 2 needs intersect, stability on one side, influence on the other, the world calls it love because strategy doesn't sell headlines. He suggested Clarissa's world had quietly evolved. Less about boxing, more about optics, less about risk, more about preservation. In that climate, questioning the path wasn't dissent, it was a threat to the machine. Charleston didn't stop there. He turned his gaze to the industry itself. Why did so many voices preaching empowerment fall silent when scrutiny mattered? Why did media echo the same safe stories? Why was critique dismissed as envy or hate? In his view, silence at that scale wasn't neutrality, it was compliance. The pattern became undeniable. Control doesn't arrive with fanfare. It seeps in, disguised as protection, loyalty, or love, until the person at the center can no longer tell where their freedom ends and the system begins. Then came one of Charleston's most unsettling observations. Repeated physical damage, fight after fight, injury after injury, creates vulnerability. And vulnerability is where dependence turns profitable. When survival demands stability more than independence, those closest to you don't just support you, they become indispensable. Not because they empower, but because life without them seems impossible. He didn't outline villains. He mapped incentives. And then he zoomed out. This wasn't just Clarissa Shields, or Papoose, or Remy Ma. It was a blueprint of modern relationships, especially public ones. Who contributes value? Who provides protection? Who controls access? Who absorbs risk? Who gets replaced when the balance shifts? Charleston White reframed it completely. This wasn't a love story gone wrong. It was a business contract performing exactly as designed, until it expired. Because when relationships are built on utility instead of trust, collapse isn't messy or emotional. It's systematic. And the most dangerous part? The truth doesn't explode. It seeps. Silently. Relentlessly. And once it begins, no amount of PR, branding, or curated silence can shove it back in. What makes this part of the story so unsettling isn't what Charleston White said. It's what suddenly clicked. By the time he reached this stage, the conversation had shifted away from personalities and into systems. Not who these people were, but how power, money, and image collide when left unchecked. Charleston didn't paint the relationship as messy or chaotic. He framed it as precise, calculated, efficient. And efficiency, in his eyes, is never romantic. It's deliberate, optimized, engineered to minimize risk and maximize output. That's when the Clarissa Shields, Papoose connection stopped looking like love and started looking like procedure. He revealed something subtle but damning. When one partner controls access to media, to narratives, to criticism, they control reality itself. Not through force, but through filtration. What reaches the public? What gets rewritten? What disappears entirely? And the most terrifying part? From the outside, it still appears as support. Charleston argued Clarissa's world had grown increasingly curated. Fewer unguarded moments. Fewer questions anyone wanted to ask. More protection disguised as loyalty. In that climate, love doesn't vanish, it transforms. It becomes leverage. Stability. Insurance. Then he turned to money, not greed, but structure. When one partner earns significantly more, the headlines rush to assign blame. Gold digger. Opportunist. User. Charleston rejected these labels outright, not to defend, but to illuminate. It wasn't about taking money. It was about access without friction. About enjoying resources as if they were shared, even when they weren't. That nuance changes everything. It shifts the lens from theft to alignment. And alignment, Charleston implied, is the backbone of modern power relationships. Ownership isn't necessary when influence suffices. Authority isn't required when proximity grants you control. And then he paused. And finally addressed the question everyone is whispering, but no one dares to confront directly.
Also makes more money than him, similar to Remy Ma. So would you consider him a gold digger?
No. A player ain't never been a gold digger. That nigga's a player. Nigga, that smooth player, nigga. Now, man, now, you always supposed to play for the bank. My grandmama told me, if a woman really like you, it ain't nothing she won't do for you. Well, grandmama, how you know if she really like you? She'll give you her money.
That line didn't land softly, because it reframed generosity as proof. Not manipulation, but confirmation. Charleston wasn't claiming money buys love. He was saying love shows itself through resources. And when someone moves freely through your assets, without resistance or question, that signals a power dynamic, whether you want to admit it or not. From there, he expanded the frame. Charleston White argued that the public fixation on who earns more completely misses the point. The real question isn't wealth, it's control. Who decides which stories reach the world? Who determines when silence is prudent? Who calculates the perfect moment to respond or vanish entirely? And within that architecture, silence becomes currency. He explained that silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. Loud voices burn bridges. Quiet ones dominate rooms. In an industry addicted to spectacle, the person who never reacts becomes untouchable because no one knows where to aim. This is where Remy Ma returned, not emotionally, but structurally. Charleston framed her as unpredictability incarnate. She spoke on her terms. She didn't smooth over conflict. She didn't sanitize tension for optics. And in a system built on brand control, unpredictability is a liability. So when the narrative moved on without her, it wasn't heartbreak. It was risk management. Charleston suggested the industry didn't just tolerate this, it profited from it. Cleaner narratives are easier to sell. Controlled relationships are easier to defend. And when critics raise their voices, they're labeled bitter, jealous, or envious. That labeling doesn't require coordination, it's cultural. It's automatic. The most unsettling part came when Charleston dissected how long arrangements like this endure. Relationships built on utility don't implode in scandal. They expire quietly, when the value shifts, when protection becomes redundant, when the asset no longer requires the gatekeeper. That's when silence stops working and leaks begin. And leaks never ask permission. Truth rarely arrives as a single explosion. It seeps in fragments, in contradictions, in moments where actions no longer match the narrative. Where loyalty stops looking like devotion and starts feeling like obligation. Charleston White tied it back to the physical cost. Repeated fights. Repeated injuries. Repeated recoveries. Physical vulnerability breeds emotional dependence. And dependence is where control becomes most profitable, not maliciously, but naturally. Because when someone is exhausted, battered, and under constant scrutiny, they stop challenging the structure that promises stability. That's how systems endure. He concluded this section by reframing marriage itself, not as romance, but as a contract. Not cynically, but practically. He argued many relationships fail because people treat marriage as emotion, not infrastructure. As feeling, not planning. And when the feelings shift, everything collapses. In Charleston's lens, relationships built like businesses survive storms. Those built like performances crumble the moment the audience changes. And that's the final unease. Because if this was never love, if it was alignment, then the silence wasn't betrayal. It was policy. And policies don't apologize. They expire when they cease to serve. Charleston White didn't tell anyone what to think. He didn't demand conclusions. He simply exposed the mechanics and let the implications sink in. And once you see the pattern, there's no going back. By the time Charleston White reached this stage of the conversation, the damage was already done. Not because of what he accused anyone of, but because of what he made impossible to ignore. The story no longer belonged to Claressa Shields, Papoose, or Remy Ma as individuals. It had become something much larger. A pattern. A system. A familiar ending that people recognize only after it's too late. Charleston White didn't say this relationship would fail. He suggested something colder. That it was never designed to last. That it had a function, a lifespan, and a quiet exit strategy built into it from the beginning. And once you accept that possibility, every moment that once looked romantic starts to feel transactional. He spoke about how modern celebrity relationships are structured to absorb pressure, not emotion. They're not built for honesty. They're built for optics. For headlines. For protection against backlash. And in that environment, authenticity becomes a liability. Vulnerability becomes a risk. Silence becomes the safest currency anyone can hold. This is where Charleston's commentary turns almost clinical. He describes how public-facing couples aren't measured by love, but by utility. Who stabilizes the brand? Who calms the storm? Who absorbs criticism without generating new ones? And once those questions replace affection, the relationship is already operating as a contract, even if no one ever signs a paper. That's when the idea of expiration enters the conversation. Charleston White suggested that relationships like this don't implode publicly. They wind down privately. There's no dramatic breakup announcement. No explosive scandal. Just distance. Delayed appearances. Carefully worded silence. The same way companies quietly phase out a product they no longer need to defend. And what makes it disturbing is how familiar that process feels. He pointed out that the public often mistakes longevity for loyalty. But longevity in controlled environments doesn't mean commitment, it means effectiveness. It means the arrangement is still serving its purpose. Once it stops, the protection fades. The silence cracks. And what was once untouchable becomes open to questioning. Charleston didn't predict a downfall. He explained inevitability. Because when a relationship is built on alignment instead of truth, it can't survive change. If the money shifts, if the relevance shifts, if the narrative shifts, the bond doesn't adapt, it dissolves. Quietly, cleanly, without apology. And then he said something that reframed everything that came before it. He argued that most people don't realize they're in a transactional relationship because transactions don't always look like exchanges. Sometimes they look like favors. Like protection. Like being shielded from criticism. Like having someone else handle the noise while you focus on performance. But every transaction has a cost. And the cost, in this case, was autonomy. Charleston White implied that Claressa Shields didn't lose her independence. He also returned to the idea of physical toll, how repeated injuries don't just affect the body, but the psyche. Pain narrows perspective. Fatigue reduces resistance. And in that state, dependence feels reasonable. Necessary, even. Especially when someone nearby is ready to manage the world on your behalf. That's when Charleston's commentaries stopped being about celebrities and started sounding like a warning. He suggested that this pattern repeats across industries. Music, sports, politics. Anywhere image matters more than truth. Anywhere silence is rewarded. Anywhere questioning the structure is framed as betrayal. And once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. Charleston White didn't spare the audience from responsibility either. He spoke about how fans participate in this system. How applause discourages scrutiny. How defending an image becomes more important than protecting a person. How questioning a narrative is treated like hate instead of curiosity. He implied that silence isn't just enforced from above, it's reinforced from below. The conversation then drifted toward legacy. What happens when the story ends? What remains when the brand no longer needs defending? Charleston suggested that the most painful realizations don't come during the peak, but after. When the applause fades. When protection is no longer necessary. When people finally ask the questions they were told not to ask before. And by then, the answers don't matter as much as the regret. He ended his breakdown by circling back to marriage, not as romance, but as infrastructure, as planning, as accountability, as shared risk. He argued that when relationships are treated like emotions, they collapse under pressure. But when they're treated like responsibilities, they endure. The irony, he suggested, is that many people reject the idea of marriage as a contract while unknowingly entering relationships that function exactly like one, just without transparency. And that's what makes this story unsettling. Because if this was never love, if it was alignment, then nobody necessarily did anything wrong. They just played their roles. They followed incentives. They protected value. They maintained silence. Until silence stopped working. Charleston White didn't close with anger. He closed with clarity. He didn't tell the audience what would happen next. He reminded them that systems don't collapse from exposure, they collapse from irrelevance. When the cost of maintaining them outweighs the benefit. And when that moment comes, the truth doesn't need a microphone. It leaks. It circulates. It waits. Because in the end, silence is only powerful while people still believe it means something else. And this is where the story stops being entertaining and starts being uncomfortable. Because once the noise fades, once the clips stop looping, once the defenses go quiet, what's left behind isn't a villain or a hero, it's a pattern. A familiar one. The kind that looks glamorous from a distance and hollow up close. What was sold as loyalty now feels like obligation. What was framed as protection now looks like control. And what people once called love suddenly carries the weight of a transaction that finally reached its limit. This is the moment the audience has to decide whether silence still sounds noble or whether it's starting to sound rehearsed. Because silence doesn't just protect people. It protects systems. It protects arrangements. It protects narratives that only work as long as nobody asks the wrong question at the wrong time. And when those questions finally slip through, everything built on image starts to tremble. There's a reason the story never ended cleanly. There's a reason answers arrived in fragments instead of confessions. There's a reason no one wants to say too much, too fast. Because once the illusion cracks, there's no way to glue it back together without admitting what it was made of in the first place. Power. Dependence. Fear of losing relevance. Fear of losing access. Fear of losing control. And that fear is louder than any accusation. What makes this tragic isn't the fallout. It's the realization that the warning signs were always there, hiding in plain sight. The quiet exits. The filtered truths. The voices that disappeared instead of being heard. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives calmly, professionally, with a smile and a strategy. So now the question isn't who is right or wrong. The question is who benefited while everyone else stayed quiet. And more importantly, who pays the price when the arrangement finally stops working. Because stories like this don't end when people stop talking. They end when the truth no longer needs permission to be heard.